it's interesting to see fairly consistent rates over, decade or so. You had the 90s were in the close to the range that we're seeing today, a little bit, on average, a little bit lower, but you did have years where there were 6 or 7. And then for the early 2000s, it was a lower rate, like 3 to 4 per year. And then now we've seen an increase again the last 5 years or so, as you discussed. And, I wonder, you have any insight into the sort of consistency, even though these are fairly statistically rare events, we seem to be having them at almost a normal pace. And that seems odd to me.
Well, if you go back to the 70s, we'd have about 1 of these events a year. In the 80s, 2, maybe 3. In the 90s, 3. Early 2000s, 3 to 4. And now we have about 6 or 7 of these events a year. So we are seeing that increase. And even when you control for population size, the increase is still present. So the question often is asked, so what's changed? What's different in our society today versus 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? And I think there's a lot of contributing factors. And we outline these in the book because I think, as you mentioned at the front end of this, we are trying to embrace the complexity of this problem. And for too long, we've all been siloed in our perspectives around it's one or the other issue. And it's not an either or proposition. It's that all these things are happening simultaneously. And you've got to embrace, the web of complexity if you're going to come to complex solutions to complex problems. And mass shootings are one of them. So, for example, you cannot talk about the rise of mass shootings without recognizing that the United States, compared to other nations, does not have the same social safety net as those other nations. So we have challenges in how we address mental health, physical health, affordability and access and everything else that can be contributing factors to when somebody's in a crisis, because that's the key thing here. Anyone who perpetrates a mass shooting is in a personal crisis. You don't perpetrate a shooting if you intend to survive, because a mass shooting is a final act. So you have to be at a point where you no longer care if you live or die to perpetrate.
Did you find that was always the case in every incident that you guys studied?
It seems to be a very common factor, actually, which is to say that there was a perspective, I think, that people would just snap one day and perpetrate this type of a crime. And that led to the going postal phenomenon that people would talk about back in the 90s when there was a spate of shootings in post offices. But the truth of the matter is there always a sort of slow build, this type of a violence. And there's usually warning signs on the pathway to it. And it's rooted in individual despair, that you get to a point where you feel like the only solution to your problem is to perpetrate a mass shooting. And so here's what's different. In today's society, we have models for this type of behavior. So mass shootings have effectively become normalized, that people can now research what did other people who felt like me do to solve their problems. And what they did is they perpetrated a mass shooting. And so if they did it, I might be able to do it too. And I think that is something that is born of the internet, 24-hour news media, social media, the general kind of climate around information. It's the dark side of that, which is there are now models for this type of behavior. There are places where you can be radicalized into this type of violence, and that's new. And then one last piece on this as well, though, is, of course, there are more firearms available. In some states, they are easily accessible. And it's a mathematical piece to this, right? You look at regular gun ownership levels, they might have even gone down from high points 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? And we know that the vast majority of people who own firearms own many firearms. So I think there was some estimates that half of all civilian-owned firearms are owned by only 5 or 10% of the population. So it's not necessarily that everybody is armed and that is what's contributing to mass shootings. But when you've got more guns in circulation, there are just simply more opportunities for those guns to fall into the hands of people that shouldn't have them. So whether it's through theft or whether it's through a purchase that's not been put through a background check or so on and so forth, people get access to firearms that can be used in violent crime. And so it's not necessarily this direct correlation between rising firearms sales and gun violence. It's more complicated than that, but it's layered on everything else. It's layered on social media, mental health, everything else is combined. And that's the complexity of this issue. It's not one, it's all.
Yeah, and we'll get more to the guns, I think, later, because I had a couple questions on that from the book. But I want to focus first on this, you call it social proofing concept, because I think that is something that I've heard talked about a lot before. You guys pin Columbine as a particular turning point in this aspect. Social proofing is sort of this idea, some people call it the riot effect, where the more something is done begins to be thought of by society as an acceptable response to a certain situation, even if it's not, I guess acceptable isn't right, but a common response, even if it's something that society views as horrendous and horrible, like we do with mass shootings. But it's sort of understood that this is something that people going through a certain type of crisis will do or could do. And that makes it more likely to happen because it sort of lowers the bar. And there are specific perpetrators who, I guess, create the norms for this act. And Columbine, in your estimation, has been one of those key moments where they've sort of created the script, I guess, that a lot of mass shooters now follow.
Yeah, I think you've articulated that really well, actually. It makes me wish that we almost packaged that for the book, because that's exactly the argument that we're trying to convey here, which is to say that, if you look at the sociological research on contagion and on how things spread throughout society, Malcolm Gladwell famously wrote about this in a piece for The New Yorker. He talked about threshold models of behavior. And he talked about how our threshold for mass shootings gets lower and lower each time somebody perpetrates a mass shooting, because it effectively is, creating a script and it's normalizing that behavior. And in our work, we see Columbine as this sort of blueprint for shootings that follow. And in some ways that was by design, because the Columbine shooters left all these legacy tokens for us to pore over. And in some ways at the time in 1999, because Columbine felt so unique, it wasn't, by the way, there had been other school shootings, but there was something about the story of Columbine that captivated the American public unlike anything else. And we put those perpetrators' faces on the front covers of magazines. We talked about them ad nauseum in 24-hour news media, but also the shooters themselves left behind these legacy tapes and the basement tapes and these tokens and everything else so that we would continue to talk about them. Well, what's now happened is all that material is out there and people now can go and find it. And in some of the darkest corners of the internet, our research shows they heroize the Columbine shooters. They celebrate them. They are martyrs for this bigger cause. And people draw inspiration from that. So Columbine is this sort of tipping point for our relationship as a society with mass shootings. And I think that's what's contributed to then the expansion of mass shootings over time. There's a scripting in our society. And by the way, that script is not just in the darkest corners of the internet. It's also in the active shooter drills we run in schools with our children. And every time we go to the movie theater and the sign flashes up and says, check for the exits in case you might be murdered. We live in a society now where this has become an everyday part of our reality. And that, for some people, can be inspiration. For most of us, it's horrific and shocking, and we don't want anything to do with it. But if you are in crisis and asking the question, how do I solve the problem? That can be the avenue to go down.